Hello, my name is Maria Sachiko Cecire. I'm an associate professor of literature and the director of the Center for Experimental Humanities here at Bard. It's a real pleasure to be in conversation today with Leon Botstein, the president of the college, as part of our Faculty Perspective series. When I came to the college in 2010, I was given the opportunity to work with colleagues here at Bard and found Experimental Humanities. EH, as we like to call ourselves, is an academic concentration and also an interdisciplinary center for experimentation with digital, analog, and conceptual methods of learning, research, and public engagement. Experimental Humanities is animated by the question, how does technology mediate what it means to be human? And this question runs through our various courses, the public-facing projects that we do, our diverse faculty and student research, and is thinking about this question of technology, not only in the current moment, although certainly in the current moment, but also over long historical stretches. The Center for Experimental Humanities has been very involved in the coronavirus response at Bard and also in our local community in a variety of ways. For instance, back in March, we put out a collection of creative assignment ideas for teaching at a distance, right as social distancing was beginning in New York when education was rapidly moving online here at Bard and elsewhere. At a time when most guidelines for transitioning to digital learning were mostly about using specific tools and platforms, our assignments were focused on how faculty can rethink their existing courses for radically different material conditions, really focusing on how to help students turn this difficult time into the best learning experience possible through small group work, opportunities for creative expression, field-based research with local ecologies and communities, and assignments that integrate whomever they might be quarantining with or in touch with virtually. These assignments have since been translated into 5 languages at their request and with the support of our Open Society University Network partners, shared widely and received many thousands of hits from all over the world. So we're very, very proud of that, and also, feel like it captures a lot of what we stand for. And given the success of these assignments, I thought I'd like to start by turning to you, Leon, and asking how you think a small liberal arts college like Bard can serve as a leader in higher education during these times of momentous upheaval and change.
Well, I want to thank you, Maria, for joining this conversation. First, I would say that Bard isn't just a small liberal arts college. As you mentioned yourself, we're part of the Open Society University Network, which is a network which stretches to Vietnam, to Kyrgyzstan, to Berlin, to the West Bank, all over the world. And the Open Society University Network courses you describe, which have been translated into many languages, are very dependent on our use of technology. And what the coronavirus pandemic, its very few silver linings, is it has forced institutions to figure out how to use what's available in technology. And we've been blessed by your presence here. I'm unabashed in saying that you're one of our rising stars, and we're proud to have you on the faculty, and you've made an incalculable contribution to innovative teaching. The one lesson to be learned is if you're good in the classroom, which we are superior in the classroom, you can have a jump start in being good in another platform and medium. And we've learned from this experience, actually, that when we return to the classroom, we'll be much more effective in using technology as opposed to being simply rigidly old-fashioned. And what your Experimental Humanities group has done under your leadership is really to put us in a leading position of how to actually teach the arts and humanities, in particularly, using this technology. And I'll give you an example. Many people worry that an older generation or scholars in the humanities and teachers in the humanities and arts are sort of rigidly, defensively old-fashioned, which they oughtn't to be. In my own field, which is music, I give you an example of a very innovative scholar, Tom Bagan, who wrote a book called The Virtual Haydn. This is about Franz Joseph Haydn, the composer of the 18th and early 19th centuries. And by using technology, he was able to record the acoustic properties of the oldest concert hall in England that still stands from the 18th century. And by using a replica of an 18th century fortepiano, and other keyboard instruments, he was able then to recreate in a studio through digital means the acoustic effect of what it was like to play in front of an audience in 1790. So we could actually reconstruct what it must have sounded like and what the impact of the instruments of the time were. And we've been able to replicate the instruments. We can build a copy of a fortepiano or a harpsichord or an early piano, but we don't really have the acoustic environment in our minds because we live in different acoustic spaces. So here, without technology, that would have been impossible, without a mixture of sampling and reproduction. And Tom wrote this fabulous book, which is about the experience that he recorded all of the keyboard music of Haydn. So that kind of innovative use, similar to the use of technology in the history of architecture, by which now, as every student knows, you can take a virtual campus tour and you can actually reconstruct the interior of Notre Dame. And with Tom Bagan's technology, we can examine the ritual of how the great isometric motets of the Middle Ages in the Notre Dame Cathedral must have sounded like in this massive space. So this is a terrifically important tool which we've been forced to perfect under your leadership, which will be indispensable as we return to the classroom.
That is such a great project. It actually calls to mind a project that we had just a year or two ago, a senior project, which was a joint experimental humanities art history project. Our student Lynn Barnett, who reconstructed in 3D virtual reality the Cedar Hill community, which is just adjoining to what's on the Bard campus now. It was a working class mill community, and the student used architectural drawings and historical documents to completely create a 3D immersive environment and to document the stories of working class people who otherwise we wouldn't really know much about, and to be able to walk through their town and think about what they were thinking about at that time. That project really blew me away, and I learned a lot from that student and from the whole process of that project. That actually makes me think about something else I want to raise. Experimental humanities is a very unusual name. There are very few places that have an experimental humanities program. We chose to name ourselves that. While we are the dedicated hub for work at the intersection of technology and the humanities at Bard, we pick the name experimental humanities over digital humanities in a moment when digital humanities was really booming. Experimentation, artistic expression, and social justice are very important to experimental humanities and its mission. And in this, I feel like we really reflect key qualities of Bard as a college. And I'd be interested to hear you talk a little bit about what place you see for these values, experimentation, artistic expression, social justice, in a world affected by COVID.
As all such questions, it's very large and uncertain. I think the word experimental is right, because higher education, a university, a college, is a confrontation between two competing ambitions. One is to preserve and transmit a long tradition of learning. That is, ideas, practices, history, achievements of the past, to make the past relevant to how we construct the future and the present. It's often said that there's nothing more controversial, not about predicting the future, but about telling the story of our past. And how we do that really affects the discussion about values and important things in the world. So the story of American history, there's not one way to tell the story. And we have changed that story through new modes of research, asking new questions. So a university is a place where new questions are asked, confronting a tradition of learning. It's not either or. And When technology comes into play, the university has absorbed and adapted to that technology. The most important technology to which it adapted is the book and the act of reading, the transition from an oral tradition to a written tradition. And we've had done made many steps like that, which include the first introduction of computation, the ability to videotape and to use video technology, or sound transmission or sound reproduction. So this is the next stage, the digital part of it. You were right to say it's experimental because it isn't only about the digital. And the digital also is not only a mechanism, the experimental touches the issue that is implicitly raised by your question. To whom are we speaking? Who has access to this? How do we preserve the legitimate concern for things that are not measured by popularity and money? You know, the study of Greek literature, ancient Greek literature, the study of your field, which you're a medievalist by training, and the study of romance and myth in the past is a very important part of how we think of the present. You and I have had many conversations about how remarkable it is that 30 years ago, 40 years ago, nobody would have thought of the Middle Ages or a mythic world that we associated with. We now with the Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter and whatever it may be, this kind of magical world seems to have no relevance. In 1900, when the opera by Carmen von Weber, which had a kind of supernatural element, was revived in 1900, they cut out all the supernatural elements because the public had no interest. There was a public interest in science and for lack of a better word, positivism. When we saw the revised version of 1900, we were shocked because when we did it here at Bard, we reinserted and augmented the supernatural element. So different generations ask different questions, and the idea of experiment is really asking, it's not about the mechanism. Digital only speaks about the medium. So we're talking not about the automobile, we're talking about migration and transportation. We're asking about the larger question. So the experimental allows you and your colleagues and the college to look at the question of the intersection of technology and access and issues of equity, the famous digital divide, which correspond to the radical inequality in our own society.
Absolutely. Yeah, you really put your finger on so much of what is important to us. And I think that we've actually seen the digital humanities as a field starting to move in that direction more and more. And it feels really gratifying to be at a place where we've been able to think about that from the beginning. And the work that our students do has been deeply inscribed in kind of wrapped up in thinking this way from the very beginning, which I think has been really enriching for the work that we do. And I guess,
yeah, the worst, I don't mean to interrupt, but the worst thing is that you are representative of what Bard doesn't try to do, which is simply to imitate established practices. That we're not in the business. One of the dangers that every institution has is to steer between two radical extremes. One, which was popular in the 60s, is jettisoning the past. You know, everything old is worthless. And technology, modern technology, has that theory. You know, young people grow up and say, what do you mean? You lived without a computer or without a smartphone? How did you do it? How did anybody write a book without, a computer, computer medium? So people imagine that history is irrelevant because technology has changed. That's not right. So the one extreme is to simply eliminate the past, and that we do at our peril. We have to reinterpret the past. We are prisoners of the way we understand the past. The other is to become rigidly conservative. say everything new is terrible. Every older generation suffers this. When I was a kid, people, walked properly, they shook hands properly, they were civilized, and look, the sort of decline of culture. We've been prisoners of a constant generational drumbeat, which some universities have found themselves clinging to, which is the way we did it must be right. And your program and scholars and teachers like yourself allow the university, and Bard is exemplary in that regard, to strike a thoughtful balance without a single answer, um, of what needs to be adapted and what needs to be preserved. Uh, what needs to be preserved with a different point of view, what needs to be adapted in a way that isn't simply a commercial adaptation. We're not simply using the digital platform the way Facebook is. That's not what we're doing. Because just because they make a lot of money doesn't make them right. So how do we facilitate communication between and among students in a way that doesn't actually, that is, shows that we think independently about the mediation between tradition and change?
Yes, when we first got together back in 2010, 2011, a whole group of faculty from every division of the college, so the arts, the social studies, the languages and literature, science, mathematics, and computing, all these faculty got together, and we came up with the pillars of what we imagined we'd like experimental humanities to stand on when we, as you say, were interested in the new digital opportunities that were available to higher education and to the humanities. But we didn't want to do the same thing. We didn't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, and so the three pillars that we end up kind of establishing for ourselves are history, theory, and experimental practice. That we want all of our students to have a sense of what is the broad breadth of media and technological history. Even one of our two core courses called the history of experiment. How have people asked questions of the world over time? Theory to help us dig in to figure out the phenomena that are happening around us are not just random elements. They are things that grow out of a world that we can understand through certain frameworks. And experimental practice, as you say, we don't want to just accept what other people have done. So often the most exciting work comes when you look with new eyes and try your hand at something. And you can understand something conceptually, but there's something really powerful about learning through doing as well. So those were really how we started, and it's how we continue going forward. And it's been really fascinating to watch. We as a concentration have existed for 8 years now, and the technology's changed so much. And I think that the digital is actually now a word that's starting to lose favor in some spheres because, as you say, it's not just about the particular medium or technology. It's more about how do we keep our eyes on the questions that are unfolding before us as our material conditions change all the time.
And I think, as well said, and I think one of the things where we want to avoid is being a prisoner of the kinds of debates that surround artificial intelligence or machines in general. There's been a long tradition historically of the fear of machines. When Watson defeated, the leading chess players, and when people, we have Siri, and we have, films made about highly programmed, anthropomorphic machines that can, even in those popular Hollywood films, what was the one where there are human beings who they discover are really machines, so to speak, and not real human beings. And this has inhabited science fiction for a long time. We're not frightened that what is human is going to be displaced. We don't take a position that, the machine can do what we do or can't do what we do. Why worry about that? The machines are human inventions in the end, and so it better to celebrate our ingenuity without fear of sacrificing our humanity. And so we the kind of 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 I would say Catholic appreciation of what can be done and learned, that um, going back to the music example, that in the end, we have no doubt that making music in real time in a public culture is what we're about. We don't think that communicating with you through this medium is what being human is about. We do believe that having a class with 30 or a debate with 300 people in a room, or a public town hall to debate a democratic measure in our communities, or to go to a church or a synagogue and to pray with a community of faithful, that no machine is going to replace that, and no virtual Eucharist is going to satisfy our concern for a religious experience. And that the wonderment that we have when we are in the physical space of a cathedral or a church or a mosque or a synagogue, these are things which are not going to go away, and neither is the classroom, and neither is a tutorial with you and a student, and neither are your classes, which are unbelievably popular among our undergraduates. That's not going to go away, and nor should it. And this technology and the technology you work with is not a threat to that, but actually, in the end, will augment our fundamental human impulses as social beings.
I agree. I hope so. I think that often people rush to one extreme or the other much too quickly. Techno-utopianism or doomsday expectations, when in reality, often it's much more about the way we navigate the world that we're given. You can't bring up science fiction and not expect me to come back with a question, because as you know, my research is on speculative fiction. I work on fantasy, as you alluded to earlier, trained as a medievalist, and work on fantasy literature and medievalisms in contemporary culture. This kind of one thing I've been thinking about lately is, the ways in which this pandemic and just more broadly, we've seen more and more dramatically the deep inequalities and injustices that are really entrenched in the systems in this country and all over the world. And I'm wondering, if you have thoughts about the ways in which humanities fields like literary studies, even subfields like speculative fiction and fantasy, might have a role to play in imagining new worlds and ways of being. It's sometimes hard to get our brains around how we might rethink what we have here. So I'd just be interested in hearing you talk a little bit about that. As you know, I'm a great believer in the humanities. I think that there is much that the humanities can do, but I do understand when people feel sometimes like, it can feel insufficient to be reading a novel and talking about it when there are so many pressing questions in the world that need to be addressed.
The humanities are at the core and the major instrument, but not the exclusive instrument of the humanities, which is language and visual and the sound that we associate with music. The means of communication are essential to every enterprise that is human, to engineering, to science, to medicine. That the American perception that there's a gap between what's useful and what's just speculative, as you suggest, or decorative. Not the case. The human impulse that we have, is guides everything we do. I would say that the science fiction, the imagining, take one of the most classic ones, which you know well, The Lord of the Rings, which many of the viewers will know. It's interesting to speculate that the picture of the utopian result of the triumph over evil is a kind of extremely simplified, almost provincial virtues of family and having a good time, of some glorified vision of the rural pre-industrial English landscape. Now, I don't actually have any emotional attachment to that, and so for romanticizing an idealized past. But literature is the way we interrogate, we explore our aspirations in a human context. The significance of love and affection, for example, as a uniquely human gift, informs the kinds of things that we aspire to. So it's the issue of aspiration and fundamental values. What's the quality of life we want to live? Whom do I want to, what kind of person do I wish to be? What are the ethics? What is my relationship to my neighbor? What do I consider a family member and whom do I consider a stranger? And what does kindness to strangers look like and why is it a virtue? Why is it that violence can't be the only means of government and fear cannot be the only instrument of developing allegiance? And how do we put our own beliefs in the context of others? In other words, the imagining of the world as a better place than we have it now comes through the imagination, the projection of worlds which are based on our humanity but are not actually real. They don't have the conceit of realism in some concrete way, but they're terribly, terribly real. Madame Bovary, the novel by Gustave Flaubert, is a great example of where he, the author, looked at the question is how a new technology, which was equitably distributed, exactly the question we're asking, the digital divide. He was looking at reading, the access to a book. And here is a case of a character who developed an image of the world and happiness that was mediated through literature and a very complex argument that this idea, whether it be of romantic love or excitement, is a kind of fiction which led to suffering and unhappiness, that actually this was a kind of a destruction. It's an idea that goes back certainly to Plato, that the idea that one can actually, and Rousseau and authors who thought, my God, you're confusing people with aspirations which are out of the realm. And that's one way of looking at it. But we face the same issue. Look at the internet. The internet, for the time being, starting with the President of the United States, has become the expression of hate, vitriol, vulgarity, misinformation, destructive conspiracy theories, hate mongering. But that wasn't the way it was invented, right? And therefore, how do we imagine the use of that technology which is not divisive, doesn't silo us, interrupt our conversation with the people who disagree with us, make us reach out, discover our common humanity? The environmental crisis, on the other hand, is one that should remind us, as the COVID crisis should, that we are in the same boat, whether we're one ethnicity or another ethnicity or one gender or one race or one skin color, that it's irrelevant. The coronavirus, it doesn't discriminate, and neither does global warming. And that the rules of evidence turn out to be pretty reliable, that not always certain, and people can make mistakes, but without understanding how the disease works, we'll never defeat it. And that requires the rigors of science and of learning. So never has learning been more important, and never has learning benefited more from technological innovation. The computer and digital world has made the delivery of medicine more possible in a more equitable manner. And we have to imagine a world where that is possible. Literature, there's never been a great illiterate scientist. Isaac Newton was concerned about matters of religion. So was Einstein. So was Marie Curie. There is no, or Barbara McClintock, there is no, it is idiotic to believe that the impulse for the betterment of the world can live without the power of the human imagination and its speculative dreaming. We are dreamers. We are a species of dreamers. And every flip phone owes its design to Star Trek, you know, every, you know, and science fiction has often been ahead of the curve. And so it seems to me that that's why liberal arts education is the best education for every doctor, every engineer, every scientist, every lawyer, every politician. And our failure to do it is a threat to the achievement of the goals of freedom and justice.
I have to say, I not only do I agree, I feel lucky every day to be at a place where my own thinking can be so shaped by the genius of my colleagues and my students that are coming from all kinds of different backgrounds. I would not have written the book I've written if it wasn't for being at Bard. I've had other colleagues say the same about the way their thinking has been expanded and stretched. And I know our students often really are, I mean, always, I think, are always profoundly grateful to have this kind of context. I mean, just one funny thing that came to mind when you were speaking is that, you know, this semester actually, you said popular classes. For the first time, I offered a 100 level course called Falling in Love, which was just a romp through some of the great works of literature about falling in love and some of the less great kind of histories of trashy romance novels as well. And I had so many students wanting to take this course. And we had some of the most amazing, rich conversations because the vast majority of these students were coming from all kinds of different backgrounds. But everybody wanted to think through this question: what does it mean to love well? How does our circumstances, how do our social environments, how does our upbringing, how do inequalities inherent in the systems where we live, how do they shape what we want, what we think we want, what we feel like we're allowed to want? And it was very ironic that we were actually in the middle of reading Love in the Time of Cholera, just as we all split up to go quarantine in our various parts of the country and world. And that novel by Gabriel Garcia Marquez is, of course, about relationships and individuals, but also about a country that is responding to pandemic. And how do different people, how are people affected differently? While, you know, coronavirus may not discriminate, our systems do often discriminate. And how do we think through what that means on a kind of global level and on a really intensely personal level? So, and of course, I'm so lucky to be able to speak to scientists and talk about what that also means in a practical sense. So it's a great pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure to speak with you and to speak with our students every day. So I'd just like to wrap up by saying thank you. This has been so much fun, and as always, so enlightening to talk.
Well, it's very nice of you, Maria. The one thing that I think we probably both agree upon is that scale. The pandemic crisis has forced us to think differently about scale. We have gone through a long period, the last phase of which would be called globalization, where we thought the bigger the better. Sam's Club, Walmart, Amazon, Facebook, the emergence of the giant, massive, the wiping out of the local retail, the wiping out of small businesses and enterprises. The truth is that the pandemic has shown that in education in particular, bigger is not better. We are able to do what needs to be done in higher education, not only because of the quality of the people we have, like yourself and our colleagues, but because we do it on a scale that is not aristocratic. They're not, you know, just 12 people, you know, but we do it on a scale that is sufficiently small that individuals still are seen as individuals. And you can't do that in a Research One university with 35,000 students. And you can't do that in a massive enterprise. And that's why class size does matter. That's why a personal connection to a teacher matters. And that's why no one learns in identically the same way. In my field, music, if you have 5 students studying the same instrument, how they learn, what they can't learn, which obstacles they meet are different. They're not all the same. And only by observing them carefully, the way a doctor would, can you find out what will help them. There's no standard issue way of doing that. And there are some things that simply can't be scaled up. And a fine liberal arts education is one that probably can't be scaled up. And so we're lucky that in a way we've learned that bigger is not always better, and that small actually might be beautiful and the best.
Thank you so much, Leon. This was
Thank
really
you.
wonderful.
My pleasure, Maria. Thank you.